This next set of instructions will give you everything you need to do the finishing steps for your boxer shorts. And the first thing that we're going to work on is the waistband. So in step 10, it tells you to baste 3 inches of your seam allowance along the waistline. Basting is a temporary stitch, so it can be a longer stitch length. And on this section of your waistband, the front and back, where you did 2 rows of stitching to reinforce the crotch, we can't open this seam very easily because we have some space between our seam allowance. So what we're going to do is just pin this down to lay on its side, and we're going to follow that seam all the way up around to the other side. And I did it that way because I want to make sure this seam is flat all the way along. If it was pressed to one side here and then pressed to the other side in the back, somewhere along the way it would be flipped or twisted, which might be uncomfortable or might make something else not lay down well. At our side seams, where we only have 1 line of stitches, we can open this seam, press it flat, and throw a couple pins. Now, the instructions tell us to sew about 3 inches. You can kind of estimate that, but it's best to check it. So I have a seam gauge here set to 3 inches. And then I'm just going to mark so I have some idea how far I need to sew. And I can do that on my other seams and also pin my other side. The purpose of this step is to hold the seam allowances out of the way so they won't block the elastic when we've finished this waistband casing and we start to put in the elastic. And you'll understand that better after we've done it. But believe me, when you're trying to feed an elastic through a casing and you get hung up on the seam allowance and can't feed it through, it's very frustrating. So this step will help. You don't really need to change any of the settings on your machine. However, we won't backstitch this step because, as I said, we're only basting, which is meant to be temporary. So we don't need to worry about it. Step 11 talks about basting 1 1/4 inches from the upper edge to mark where you're going to fold your waistband. We don't actually need to do that. We can measure when we fold to make our waistband casing. So feel free to do this step if you'd like, or mark with your chalk 1 1/4 inches from the top edge, but it really isn't necessary. In the next step, we're going to be pressing 1/4 inch of the top edge. And if you want to check this with your seam gauge, You can, but really we can just eyeball this. And there is usually far more material at the top of the waistband of these shorts than most of you typically need. You don't wear your shorts as high as these are sort of designed for. We're gonna fold it about this much. You can press it with an iron, but just finger pressing is totally fine, which is just sort of folding and creasing, and it stays well enough. And we'll throw a few pins in as well. So we're gonna do this around the entire top of the waist, and we're gonna make it consistent and even. And now we will sew this. And we can remove our pins. The next step of the directions says to form the waistband casing, we're going to press the upper edge to the wrong side along the basted fold line. This basically means that if we had this 1 inch from here marked, so this is an inch, that we would fold this way and make our waistband casing. Now, we're actually going to be using a much wider elastic than what your directions call for. Your directions use a 1/2 inch elastic, and what we have is an inch, you can see. So if you're buying your own supplies and you buy 1/2 inch wide elastic, certainly folding your casing to an inch width is perfectly fine. We're going to do 2 inches to accommodate our wider elastic, and that's going to give us a little bit of room top and bottom, plus accommodate our seam allowance. So what we need to do now is fold and pin a 2 inch waistband casing along the entire upper edge, and make sure that you're folding it to the wrong side, just as the directions tell you, so the inside, like this. And we can use our seam gauge to make sure we're sticking to approximately 2 inches, and we will pin this all the way around, and we're going to pin it at the bottom because that's where we'll be sewing. Personally, I find when I'm pinning something like this that needs to be consistent, I like to do it in sections. So I started with center back seam here. Now I'm at the side seam, and I'm going to pin that next. And then I can stretch the fabric so that I make sure everything's pinned evenly. Once we're done, we're sewing this now. Look for the markings you made, which pieces are the fronts and the backs. So you can see here I have 2 back panels, B, B, And so this is going to be the center back. And this is where I want to start my waistband casing. I'm going to start sewing to one side of the center back pin, and I'm going to back stitch to secure my stitches. This is not basting, this is going to be permanent. I'm going to sew on top of my row of stitches that is already here from when I did this turned under 1/4 of an inch. And you can now see that the reason for doing this 1/4 of an inch first is that now the bottom of our waistband casing has a nice finished edge. We're not seeing any raw edges here, frayed threads, anything like this, like we would see if we had just folded it over and not done this 1/4 inch first. So I'm going to back stitch and sew around, and when I get back to the center back again, I want to stop slightly before the center back pin. So I'm actually going to leave an opening here of about 1 to 2 inches. And again, make sure you back stitch where you start and stop. Now we can remove our pins, and then it will be time to put in the waistband. So the best way to put in our waistband elastic is going to be using a safety pin, and I'll show you why that is. In order to get the correct length for your elastic, you're going to want to wrap the elastic around your waist at the point where your waistband would be when you're wearing the shorts. And you want it pulled so that it's slightly stretched, but not pulled so much so that it's constricting you in order to fit around your body. So you don't want it completely loose, but you don't want it overstretched either. And you should expect to have enough to overlap about 1 inch from each end. I've measured this one already because I'm making these shorts for my son. So I measured this elastic to his body and cut it to the appropriate length. I have put the safety pin into the end of the elastic and secured it. And this is going to help me feed the elastic through, because if I try to just push this through, it'll work okay to start with. But there's going to come a point very quickly where trying to hold on to this and trying to feed it through becomes very frustrating. So with my safety pin, as I push the elastic through, I can take more fabric and push it along the safety pin, which I can feel inside, and then pull it, and it draws the elastic through further. So I'm going to continue doing this. I'm going to try as much as I can not to let the elastic twist inside of here. And when the end of the elastic starts to come close to this opening, I'm going to put a pin to prevent this from being pulled all the way in. We don't want to lose the tail end of our elastic. So I'm going to pin that right here and finish threading this through the waistband. This is where you'll see why that original basting we did on your seam allowances can come in really handy, because when you come to these points where you have these seam allowances inside, you can just feed this through without any problem. If the seam allowances weren't secured, your safety pin or the end of your elastic could hit between the seam allowance and the fabric instead of in between the seam allowances inside the channel of the casing. And then you just fiddle around trying to find the opening. It's very difficult. So this is where having done this step is saving us time now. Try not to accidentally open your safety pin by compressing it too much. So once we pull this all the way through, we can remove our safety pin. And now I'm also going to pin this other free end of the elastic. And then I'm just going to stretch this to get the elastic to pull all the way through. And then I want to make sure, just by feeling, that my waistband elastic is not twisted anywhere. And then once I'm certain it's not twisted, I'm going to overlap the ends, put a pin to hold them, and then I'm going to sew this up, down, left, right, back, forth several times over and over to secure this, because I don't want this coming apart inside my waist and letting loose my entire elastic. Before I start sewing, I'm going to pull some extra slack out of the casing to give myself lots of space when I'm sewing. So this is nice and secure. No way this is coming loose. And now I can trim the loose threads. And then we pull the waistband casing all the way along the elastic so we're sure it's in there securely. Double check again to make sure it's not twisted anywhere, because this would be the time to fix it if it is. And then we go back to our opening and we're going to secure this little space and just backstitch, sew it closed. After you have sewn it closed, this step, number 15, to prevent the elastic from rolling, stitch in the ditch of the center front, center back, and side seams across the waistline casing of the boxers. What that means is we don't want our elastic to get all twisted and weird, as can sometimes happen with clothes that have elastic in the waistline. So what we're going to do is first hold your boxers and then pull the elastic to its limit so that when you let go, you know that the elastic is evenly distributed everywhere. And then any one of your seams, doesn't matter which one you start with, but put it under the machine with the seam lined up with your needle. because this is what stitch in the ditch means. It means for your stitches to fall right in this groove of the seam, which will prevent us from having the stitches visible on the right side of the garment. We'll just backstitch and sew, and we'll do this on each of the 4 seams that are in the top of the waistband. So now I'm going to trim all of these loose threads, and then we will set up to do the last step, which is the hem. The final step of the project is the hem, which is the bottom of the legs. So the first step is to try the shorts on and make sure that the length is comfortable for you, but more importantly, that both legs are starting out the same length, because if they're crooked to start with and then you do the same hem on each of them, they're going to be crooked when you're finished. I have already checked this with my son, and I know that I can work with them the way they are. So in your directions, it says to do 1/4 of an inch all the way around, just like you did for the waistband as your first step. This is going to guarantee that you have a nice finished inside edge of your hem in the top of the fold, as opposed to a raw edge on the inside. So you would pin and sew this 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and then after, fold it an additional 3/4 of an inch, and sew again, making your finished hem. That is absolutely fine if you'd like to do it that way, if you feel more comfortable doing it that way. What I'm going to show you is a second method that is a little faster if you're comfortable doing it this way, and that is to simply do 1/2 an inch and then another 1/2 an inch. You've got the same 1-inch seam, but we're only going to have to sew once. I like to do the sides first. Now again, I want to press this seam the same way that it was at the top, and you can see it was flat when it was sewn in the crotch seam. So I'm going to keep it flat here, and again, 1/2 an inch, 1/2 an inch. Certainly check your measurement. Once I have the sides, I can make sure that I do the rest evenly. I don't want any puckers in my hem, any wrinkles. And now I'll do the same for the other leg. We're ready to sew our final step. When we sew our hems, a couple things we need to be cautious of. One is to make sure that our legs are open and we're not accidentally sewing the legs shut as we hem. And then we're going to put the edge of the presser foot just beyond the top edge of the fold. That way our stitches will be at the top of our hem. If we sew too far down or way at the bottom, our hem will gap, or we might even have raw edges that are able to roll unfolded. I did not backstitch at the beginning, and as long as you end on top of your original set of stitches and you backstitch at the end, that will also serve to secure the stitches at the beginning. And here you have your finished shorts. I've trimmed all of my loose threads